At exactly 6:47 a.m. on December 8, 1941, the air over Canton, Ohio, didn't just carry the bite of a Midwestern winter. It carried the weight of a sudden, violent transformation. The morning shift whistle tore through the silence, a shrill industrial scream that signaled more than just the start of a workday. It was a call to arms for 11,000 men and women stepping through the iron gates of the Timken Roller Bearing Company. Most of them had spent the previous evening huddled around vacuum tube radios, listening to the fractured, terrifying reports from Pearl Harbor. They walked into the plant as civilians, but by the time they reached their stations, they had become the vanguard of an industrial army. The Timken plant was not just a factory. It was a sprawling, soot-stained titan of industry, covering 47 acres of Ohio soil. It was a labyrinth of concrete, glass, and steel, where the air tasted of sulfur and heavy cutting oil. To a casual observer, the machinery was a chaotic blur of motion, but to the engineers, it was a finely tuned instrument of production. Within 72 hours of the first bomb falling in Hawaii, the atmosphere inside Timken shifted from steady commerce to a frantic, white-hot urgency. Every production line, every lathe, and every grinding wheel was being retooled for a singular, lethal purpose: the total mechanization of war. The machinery did not stop. It could not stop. The workers realized, perhaps for the first time, that the safety of the world was being calculated in the tolerances of the parts they held in their grease-stained hands. If you value stories like this, stories that strip away the romanticism of the battlefield to reveal the cold, hard machinery of history, then consider joining us. This is not just a tale of conflict. It is a blueprint of human resolve forged in the fire of necessity. We explore the forgotten infrastructures that make victory possible, and today, that story begins in a factory in Ohio. By December 1941, the geopolitical landscape was a nightmare of industrial dominance. Germany held continental Europe in an iron grip, fed by the massive Krupp steelworks in Essen. Japan controlled the Pacific, its ambitions fueled by the shipyards of Mitsubishi in Nagoya. These weren't just rivals. They were factories designed for the mass production of death. America's advantage, meanwhile, existed primarily on paper. It wasn't about tactical genius or superior soldiers. It was about capacity, the ability to build faster, produce more, and outlast any enemy through sheer industrial momentum. But to move a nation, you need more than will. You need bearings. Ball bearings. Two words that sound mundane, even boring, until you understand their role in mechanized slaughter. Every tank turret that rotates to find a target does so on a bed of bearings. Every aircraft propeller that bites into the air spins because of them. Every artillery piece, every truck axle, and every B-17 bomber engine depends on these precision machine spheres of hardened steel. Without them, modern warfare grinds to a catastrophic halt. Tanks seize up. Aircraft fall from the sky like lead weights. Artillery pieces jam in the heat of battle. The disparity was lethal. In 1941, Germany was producing nearly 200 million bearings annually. Japan was churning out another 70 million. The United States, at the start of the war, was producing fewer than 60 million. This wasn't a theoretical gap. It was a death sentence for American boys on the front lines. The panzer divisions rolling across North Africa in early 1942 didn't fail because they lacked courage. They failed when their bearings wore out faster than the supply chain could replace them. By mid-1942, German tank commanders were reporting mechanical breakdown rates of nearly 30%. Bearings overheated, seals failed, and axles locked, turning invincible tanks into stationary targets. Allied intelligence understood this industrial bottleneck perfectly. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, identified bearing production as the industrial keystone of the German war machine. He told Hitler that if the bearing plants were destroyed, the Wehrmacht would collapse within 4 months. The Allies reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction: outproduce the Axis, and choke their ability to wage war. Timken wasn't the largest manufacturer in the States, but it possessed a unique weapon, the tapered roller bearing. This design could handle both radial and thrust loads simultaneously, a technical necessity for the heavy, punishing machinery of war. From naval gun turrets to the drive shafts of heavy bombers, the world was about to run on Timken steel. By early 1942, the math facing the Timken Roller Bearing Company was not just daunting, it was mathematically impossible. The War Production Board had issued a mandate that sounded like a fever dream: quintuple the output in 6 months. Timken, which had spent decades perfecting a pace of 12 million bearings a year, was now ordered to produce 50 million by June. If they failed, American tanks in North Africa would remain iron coffins, unable to maneuver against Rommel's Desert Fox. This was the burden that fell onto the shoulders of Arthur Hess, Timken's chief metallurgist. Hess was a man who lived in a world of alloys and phase diagrams, but now he was fighting a war of seconds. To increase production at this scale, you can't just hire more people, you have to cheat time. Each bearing underwent a grueling 14-step process: forging, heat treating, multiple stages of grinding, and microscopic inspection. The bottleneck was the heat treating furnace. You cannot rush the molecular restructuring of steel without risking a brittle, useless product. Hess began to dissect the heat treating cycle with the precision of a surgeon. He recalculated the cooling curves and the carbon absorption rates for every batch of steel. Through a series of high-stakes experiments, he discovered he could shave exactly 11 minutes off the furnace time per batch without compromising the structural integrity of the metal. 11 minutes doesn't sound like a victory, but across 40 massive furnaces running 24 hours a day, it translated into an extra 16,000 bearings every single week. It was a miracle of efficiency born from pure engineering desperation. But then, disaster struck the supply chain. In July 1942, an electric arc furnace at Republic Steel, Timken's primary supplier, suffered a catastrophic failure. Suddenly, Timken's inventory of bearing-grade steel plummeted to a mere 7-day supply. The plant was facing a total shutdown in a week. Hess didn't wait for government bureaucracy. He personally scouted every small mill within a 200-mile radius. He found 2 obscure facilities that had the capacity but lacked the knowledge to produce the complex alloy required for high-stress bearings. Hess sent his own metallurgists to live on site at these mills, adjusting furnace chemistry in real time. The first batches were failures: too much carbon, too many impurities. But Hess stayed on the floor, tasting the grit in the air, until on the 11th day, the steel met the spec. Timken never stopped. The margin of victory was measured not in miles of territory, but in hours of furnace fuel. As the men went to the front, the factory floor at Timken underwent a demographic earthquake. In 1940, you could count the number of women in the plant on a few hands, and they were mostly confined to clerical desks. By mid-1942, nearly 3,000 women were operating heavy lathes, precision grinders, and high-pressure inspection stations. This wasn't symbolic work. It was a brutal, high-stakes immersion into industrial fire. The environment was sensory assault. The noise levels exceeded 90 decibels, a constant, rhythmic screaming of metal against stone. Fine metal dust filled the air, settling in hair, lungs, and clothes. Safety guards were often discarded because they slowed down the frantic pace of the quotas. In this chaos, women like Rose Kaminsky became the elite snipers of production. Rose worked the midnight shift on a centerless grinder, tasked with finishing bearing rollers to a variance of less than 5/10,000ths of an inch. To put that in perspective, that is a fraction of the width of a human hair. In her first month, Rose was overwhelmed, rejecting 30 pieces a shift. But as the months dragged on, something remarkable happened. Her hands began to learn what her eyes could not see. She developed a tactile intuition, a feel for the metal. She could hear the subtle change in the pitch of the grinding wheel that meant it needed dressing. She could feel a roller that was a microscopic fraction off round, simply by the vibration of the machine. By her 6th month, her rejection rate dropped to near zero. But the cost was steep. There was a cruel disparity that history often ignores. These women performed the same back-breaking, lung-clogging work as the men, yet they were paid significantly less, 75 cents an hour compared to the men's 110. It was a policy of the era, a cold industrial fact that these women accepted because they knew what was at stake. For many, like Mary Kowalski, the work was a prayer. Mary ground rollers by day, while her son, James, piloted a B-24 Liberator over occupied France. Every bearing she finished was a silent wish that the engine in her son's plane would hold together for one more mission. At Timken, the war wasn't fought with bullets, it was fought with micrometers and the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of the American worker. As the production numbers at Timken climbed toward the heavens, the human cost on the factory floor sank into the depths of tragedy. The expansion was not just physical, it was a psychological and biological siege. By 1943, the factory at Canton was no longer a workplace. It was an industrial totalitarian state where every resource, including human life, was spent with cold, calculating efficiency. Safety was a luxury that the War Production Board deemed too expensive for the schedule. Machines operated without guards because a steel mesh cage meant a 3-second delay in loading a part. In a factory producing millions of units, those seconds were measured in lives on the front lines, so the guards stayed off. The results were predictable and horrific. Fingers were crushed in heavy presses. Skin was seared to the bone by the 2,000-degree heat of the furnaces, and the air, thick with a permanent mist of coolant and pulverized steel, became a slow poison. Respiratory issues were not a possibility. They were an eventual certainty for anyone walking the grinding floor. But the most chilling moment in Timken's wartime history occurred in February 1944. It was a cold night, the kind where the metal feels like ice until it hits the furnace. A massive overhead crane was transporting a heat-treating furnace, a gargantuan 11-ton iron box still radiating a residual heat of over 200 degrees. Without warning, a stressed cable snapped. The sound was like a cannon shot. The furnace plummeted 20 feet, crashing onto the concrete floor with a force that shook the entire 47-acre complex. 2 workers were crushed instantly, silenced forever beneath 11 tons of glowing steel. A third lingered for 3 days in agony before succumbing to internal injuries. The industrial machine's response was a masterclass in wartime pragmatism. The Ohio Industrial Commission conducted an investigation that lasted barely long enough for the bodies to be buried. They cited inadequate maintenance and operator error, and Timken paid a fine of exactly $800. To the state, 3 human lives were worth less than a few hundred high-precision bearings. After a 14-hour cleanup, the blood was scrubbed from the concrete, the crane was repaired, and production resumed. There was no moment of silence. There were no flags at half-mast. The war required bearings, and the dead were replaced by new recruits within hours. Men and women who were given a single day of training before being told to feed the very machines that had just claimed their predecessors. While the workers in Canton bled for production, Allied intelligence was looking at the German industrial heartland through the same cold lens. They realized that the entire Nazi war machine rested on a single, fragile pillar: the city of Schweinfurt. Nestled in Bavaria, Schweinfurt was the bearing capital of the Third Reich, housing the massive VKF and FAGI plants that produced nearly half of Germany's military bearings. The logic was simple and devastating. Destroy the bearings, and the Luftwaffe falls from the sky, the panzers stop in their tracks, and the Wehrmacht chokes on its own mechanical failure. On August 17, 1943, the theory was put to a bloody test. 230 B-17 flying fortresses, many of them equipped with Timken-designed bearings in their engines and landing gear, took off for a daylight raid on Schweinfurt. It was a mission of industrial assassination. The air battle was a massacre. The Germans knew what was at stake and threw every fighter they had at the American formations. 60 bombers were shot down. 600 crew members were lost in a single afternoon. The mission was a tactical catastrophe, but a strategic validation. It proved that in total war, the most valuable targets aren't generals, they're grinding machines. But as the German factories burned and were forced to disperse their production into hidden mines and forced labor camps, Timken's output in Ohio reached a state of industrial totalitarianism. By late 1943, they were producing 150 million bearings every 6 months. The plant never slept. Maintenance windows, led by veterans like Walter Brzezinski, shrank to 4-hour intervals. Brzezinski was a man who could hear a failing bearing inside a machine housing through the roar of the factory. His ability to predict a mechanical seizure before it happened saved thousands of hours of production. He understood that a failed grinder in Ohio was just as dangerous as a German flak gun over Schweinfurt. Both could stop a production line, and both could cost lives. The bearings leaving Canton were now everywhere. They were in the M4 Sherman tanks chasing Rommel through the dust of Libya. They were in the naval gun mounts of destroyers in the Pacific, providing the smooth rotation needed to track Japanese Zeros. And they were in the axles of the deuce-and-a-half trucks that would soon flood across the beaches of Normandy. The invasion of June 6, 1944, was not just a victory of courage, it was a victory of the supply chain. Every Churchill tank that roared off a landing craft carried the silent, spinning legacy of Canton, Ohio. The Allies didn't just outfight the Axis, they out-manufactured them, one steel roller at a time. By the end of 1944, the Timken Roller Bearing Company had achieved something that transcended manufacturing. It had performed an act of industrial sorcery. Since that cold morning in December 1941, the plant in Canton had produced over 2 billion ball and roller bearings. 2 billion. It is a number so vast that the human mind struggles to contain it. If you were to stack those bearings, they would form a metallic pillar reaching 17 miles into the stratosphere. If you laid them end to end, they would circle the Earth twice. But they weren't stacked, and they weren't displayed. They were invisible, tucked away inside the gearboxes of bombers, the transmissions of tanks, and the drive shafts of the ships that reclaimed the world. The war in the Pacific raged on into 1945, and Timken's production lines continued to scream at maximum capacity. Even as Germany fell in May, the planners of Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Japan, were demanding millions of additional bearings for the amphibious assault craft that would storm the Japanese home islands. But the atomic flashes over Hiroshima and Nagasaki rendered those grim projections unnecessary. On August 15, 1945, at 11:02 p.m., the night shift whistle sounded across Canton. The war was over. But for the workers at Timken, the victory brought a strange, quiet displacement. The workforce, which had swelled to 17,000, began to shrink almost overnight. The women who had mastered the centerless grinders and the precision lathes, women like Rose Kaminsky, were the first to be let go. The narrative of Rosie the Riveter was a wartime convenience, and with the return of the servicemen, that convenience expired. Rose left the factory in 1946. She didn't receive a medal, and she never spoke publicly about the 3 years she spent breathing metal dust and holding tolerances to 5/10,000ths of an inch. She simply went home, a silent veteran of an invisible front. Arthur Hess and the engineers continued their work, but the fire was different. The innovations born from wartime desperation, predictive maintenance, optimized heat treating cycles, and high-stress alloys became the global standards of the modern age. Every car you drive and every plane you board today carries the technical DNA of the Canton plant. Yet, the physical site did not survive the relentless march of late-century economics. In 2009, after over a century of production, Timken shifted its operations overseas. The massive brick buildings were demolished, reduced to rubble and memories. Today, if you drive to that address in Canton, you won't see a monument to the 47 workers who died on the floor. You won't see a statue of Arthur Hess or Margaret Caldwell. You will see a logistics center and a parking lot. There is a small weathered plaque near the entrance, but most people drive past it without a second glance. They don't realize they are standing on the ground where the heartbeat of the Allied machine was forged. History records the names of the generals and the dates of the battles, but the details of manufacturing tolerances and shift schedules are forgotten. Yet, the truth remains. The Wehrmacht didn't lose a war of ideas. It lost a war of capacity. German tanks didn't fail because of a lack of courage. They failed because their bearings wore out faster than they could be replaced. The victory was built by people who understood that precision wasn't optional. At Timken, they didn't just make bearings. They made the components of freedom, one steel roller at a time. The machines have finally gone silent, but the world they built is still turning.